Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening. I do hope that you're so well and that you're having the most fabulous day or about to embark on a fabulous day, or you're about to have an amazing evening. Doesn't matter what it is, I just hope you're ready to listen to a fabulous story, because I think you're going to need a hot cup of cocoa for this one. I don't know if any of you have nostalgic memories about Milkman delivering milk for you. Some people still have their milk delivered today, but for the vast majority of us, we actually buy the milk from the supermarket, and that's just the way it is these days. But in the olden days, they used to deliver milk to your front door. And this is a milkman who really had some rather unusual encounters. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Bernard, although most people call me Ben, and I grew up in a small rural town in North America where everybody knows each other. And it is for this reason that I'd like to keep the area where I reside a mystery, in case someone I know is listening and this personal story pops out of the bag like a proverbial jack-in-the-box and becomes angredized or something. I promise you the last thing I want is to be the centre of gossip in my small town. It's not a nice feeling to have people whispering about you and pointing behind your back. Even when they do not make it obvious to you, you can rarely sense when you're the subject of gossip, as everybody becomes incredibly quiet when you enter a shop or something, and then you know without a shadow of a doubt that moments earlier they were actually gossiping about you. It happened to our family once when my overweight mother suddenly lost a ton of weight and looked so drawn, pale and emaciated. Invariably rumours abounded around our small town that my mother was dying of cancer, which wasn't true of course, but my mother lost all the weight rapidly because her sister, who lived out of state, had been killed in a road traffic accident, and my mother just stopped eating because she was so devastated. I remember how upset the entire family was to have those ugly rumours circulating and being thrown around like a soccer ball in a public stadium, which is why I do tend to keep my mouth shut when it comes to family business and personal affairs, if you get my drift. I live in a rather modern contemporary style home with large panes of seamless glass that overlook exquisite areas of rolling green countryside, rugged mountainous outcrops, exquisite silvery lakes, lily-covered ponds, and acres upon acres of forest that literally stretch back for miles, consisting of oaks, spruces and maple trees, which is an ideal habitat for the indigenous wildlife such as the white-tailed deer. The White House where I live was built in 1997, but the original house prior to this new development actually belonged to my grandfather, and I always believe it was a travesty knocking down the former original traditional 1800s farmhouse to build a more modern architect's creation just to appease my mother. Sorry, Mum, if you're listening, but I don't like your state-of-the-art modern taste. I've never been a fan of modern futuristic architecture because the edges are way too sharp for my liking, and the buildings almost seem cold, clinical and characterless. And as for the interior design, it's a little too austere and office-like in my opinion. My mother would hasten to disagree with me because she adores modern contemporary design, which is why we live in such a monstrous modern box-style home with large open floor plans and spacious entertainment areas with a symmetrical designed back and front yard, where the scattering of fruit trees seem almost too formal for the space, which is seemingly so incongruous and contradictory with the natural curves and artistic marvels of Mother Nature herself. On the subject of Bigfoot, since I was about 14 years old, I've always been a huge Bigfoot fan, but I kept my fascination for the hairy critter pretty much a big secret, as I couldn't face being ridiculed or laughed at, as invariably you always get people who believe that Bigfoot belongs on the pages of pulp fiction or fantasy novels, but I never believed that for a moment. I knew in my gut that the hairy critter was absolutely real, and although he got a negative press, I kind of always rather secretly liked the critter for reasons I cannot explain. My story begins when the coronavirus hit worldwide, and this global pandemic was causing pandemonium and escalating concern about the elderly and physically compromised. My grandfather on my father's side, whom initially owned the former house on our land, was now living in frail care, and at the time one of the residents there had recently died of the coronavirus. When my mother heard about the horrifying news, she insisted my grandfather came to live with us immediately because he had huge issues and complications with his lungs, and so if he caught the virus, my mother was pretty certain He was a goner, so to speak. As a boy growing up, I only ever visited my grandfather a handful of times and got to see him on Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays, but until more recently I did not have a close relationship with him. I falsely believed that growing up in a different generation that my grandfather and I were poles apart, with so little in common. I was to realise that this extraordinary wizened old man, with his wrinkled skin and tortoise-like face, with the small brown sparkling eyes, was like a kindred spirit, and we had much more in common than I ever imagined possible. In fact, the irony is that my grandfather is an older, much more wiser version of myself. It was on a late Saturday night when my parents had all retired to bed and my grandfather was watching a programme on television, and I was listening to YouTube Bigfoot stories. My grandfather suddenly glanced up at me curiously and asked me how the strange technology I was using actually worked. You see, my grandfather owned a cell phone and barely knew how to operate it properly because modern technology was a little too overwhelming for him. I began to show him my tablet, and of course he was looking through all my recommended videos, many of them being Bigfoot stories. As my grandfather scrolled through my tablet, he looked up to me with a big, beaming, jubilant smile and pointed to a picture of Bigfoot. "I've seen one of those," he said, as if he was recalling the most wonderful, amazing memory. So this is my grandfather's story, as he told me. As you know, I lived on this property when it was a former 1800s home, before this modern, charmless monstrosity was erected in its place. I lived here with your grandmother and your father, who was a very little boy of about 7 at the time, and his younger brother Aaron. There was a dairy farm not far from here, and I became a milkman in the local area, delivering milk to all the local residents. After a while, the dairy was also offering deliveries of fruit and vegetables to people in the area, so sometimes in the back of my dairy cart there would invariably be a few boxes of fruit and vegetables for local residents. Every morning I'd get up at the crack of dawn at about 3 a.m. to go out on my dairy stint around the local area, and at this time of the morning it was usually dusky, but the winters were the worst here, because the weather was freezing cold, and during these winter days, of course, it was always much darker on those biting blizzard-like mornings. So every single morning I would manoeuvre my little milk cart down some of those rough dirt roads, all the while jingling the milk bottles, and they would wobble precariously in their box containers, making that tinkering sound which is so reminiscent of milk being delivered. Come rain, shine, hail or snow, I would be out there embracing the harassing, formidable elements, and delivering my milk while the whole world around me was silently fast asleep. Rising out of my bed in the early morning was a struggle, but once I was out there with the cool breeze blowing against my face and the sun beginning to rise over the horizon, dappling the area with an exquisite morning light, which was only enhanced by the beautiful sounds of the dawn chorus, I promise you those were the best times to be up and about, and I enjoyed bustling around delivering the milk to all the locals. One morning when it was still very dark outside in the early hours, I was delivering milk to the front door of the Baker family home, when I heard this very peculiar strange sound coming from behind one of the bushes in the front yard. It truly sounded like someone was in agonising, tortuous pain. So imagine my horror when I discovered little Tammy Baker, who was no more than 15 at the time, hiding behind the bushes, squatting on the ground and making these groaning whimpers. I noticed that she had a cloth stuffed in her mouth to suppress the noise that she was making, so I rushed over to her and I pulled the gag out of her mouth and asked her what on earth she was doing behind the bushes at this ungodly hour of the morning, and why on earth wasn't she in bed. Suddenly it became all too horrifying clear for me, and very, very surreal, when I realised that little Tammy Baker was actually giving birth to a baby, because she was pushing very hard, and with each push she would hold her breath and cry out in terrible pain, moaning, groaning, gasping and sweating. I was just about to call for help when she begged me not to call her parents, or anybody else for that matter. "Please don't, Bob," she interjected between her puffs and frantic gasps. "If Dad knows about this, he is going to kill me, and I'm not kidding either. He'll throw me out onto the streets and never ever speak to me again. I'll have brought such huge shame on my entire family, and they'll look at me in such disgust and contempt forever. Please, Bob, you can't tell a solitary soul about this, because if you do, my life is forever ruined." "But what about this baby? It needs a mother," I protested.
I'm going to give it up for adoption, Bob. I have to. It's best for the baby. I can't possibly keep it. I'm only 15. I haven't even got a job, and nor have I finished school yet. Are you sure about this? I asked. I've thought about it, Bob, long and hard, she said, and I can't raise a kid on my own. Very well, I said. Your secret's safe with me. So let me help you deliver this baby. Oh, my God, she cried. It's coming. Oh, it's coming. Oh, it's coming. Oh, no. Please will you go inside, into the house, Bob, and grab me some towels from the bathroom. Make sure you wake nobody up. Oh, you can't wake up my mum and Dad, because if you do, they'll do their nut. Oh, if they see what's going on here. I obediently crept through the baker's house, terrified that a creak of the floorboards might alert the bakers to my presence, but somehow I managed to grab some towels from the bathroom and a knife from the kitchen. I ran out of the baker's house with a knife and towels, and that was when the head of the baby came sliding through Tammy's legs like a jet plane that was very eager to land. That baby wanted to be born, and it was not going to wait for anybody. I helped Tammy deliver her beautiful baby, and I did the honours of cutting the cord. It was a poignant, magical moment for myself and for Tammy, one that I shall never ever forget. I felt incredibly privileged and honoured to share in this spectacular, intimate moment with her. I obediently crept through the baker's house, terrified that a creak of the floorboards might alert the bakers to my presence, but I managed to grab some towels from the bathroom and a knife from the kitchen. So I ran out of the baker's house with a knife and the towels, and that was when the head of the baby came sliding through Tammy's legs like a jet plane that was very eager to land. The baby wanted to be born, and it wasn't going to wait for anyone. I helped Tammy deliver her beautiful baby, and I cut the cord. It was a poignant, magical moment for myself and Tammy, one I will never forget. I felt privileged and honoured to share in this spectacular, intimate moment with her, especially behind the bush in the yard. I immediately wrapped the beautiful baby in a towel and patted its back hard so that it let out a loud cry. I was so terrified that the cry would wake up the neighbourhood, but luckily no one stirred. I wiped down the baby and handed it back to Tammy, who was bobbing it up and down in her arms and smiling jubilantly. You couldn't wipe the smile off her face, she looked so delighted. "Oh, he's so beautiful," she gasped. "Oh, isn't he beautiful? I so wish I could keep him, but it's not remotely conceivable. I'm way too young to have a baby." I remember I persuaded Tammy to come home with me, and I woke up your grandmother, who has a nursing background, so she knew what needed to be done. She was in her absolute element, bustling around like a clucking mother hen, attending to Tammy's every single need, washing towels and clothes for her, giving her a long soak in a hot bath, and looking after the baby. Your grandmother took care of the baby for Tammy until she was 100% certain that she wanted to put it up for adoption, and then we helped her with the adoption process without her parents ever finding out. Do you really think the parents would have disowned her? Oh, I'm afraid I do. They were very strict, no-nonsense kind of family, and in those days having a baby out of wedlock was very highly frowned upon. Mr. Baker came from a very staunch Irish Catholic background, and he would have been incensed about the birth, and who knows what he would have done. So I'm glad we kept the whole thing secret for Tammy's sake, I must say. How did she manage to hide her pregnancy from her parents? I mean, surely she was showing by then. Well, I imagine she was, but Tammy was very good at dressing in loose clothes if she needed to, so I imagine that's what she did. Did Tammy ever get to see her beautiful baby again? Well, it was actually a very charming story, because Tammy was able to visit her son very regularly while he was growing up, as the adopted family wanted Tammy involved in their son's life. She even became his godmother. It's very unusual for this to happen, but the parents wanted their son to know their other mother, so things worked out exceedingly well. Later on, Tammy went on to have 3 children all of her own, but never lost touch with her beautiful boy, who grew up to be a very fine young man. I gather he was to become a fabulous food critic, writing up about restaurants and so forth all over North America. Wow, what an incredible story, Grandpa! Well, your grandmother played an instrumental role in ensuring things worked out for Tammy, which they did, because imagine if the parents had got involved, things would have turned out really terrible. What about your Bigfoot encounter, I asked. What happened there? Well, sometimes when I was delivering milk, I almost always sensed that I was being stalked, and I felt pretty certain that something or someone was actually watching me, but what I couldn't imagine. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there, and so obviously I thought I was going stark raving mad. Was I imagining this? At the time I was delivering fruit and vegetables to some of the locals, and I kept getting complaints that they were not getting their full quota of fruit and vegetables, which became a huge mystery to me. I packed the boxes myself, so I knew that I'd included everything that they'd ordered, so I was actually rather befuddled as to what on earth was going on. People would be missing bags of grapes, bunches of bananas, peaches and fruit that I swore I'd packed, and I couldn't make any sense of it at all. I felt very muddled and confused. I knew that somewhere on my milk round that someone must be pilfering the fruit order, and so I decided to set up a trap by putting bunches of bananas in a bag with a cat bell attached to it, so that when the perpetrator took the bananas, I would be alerted to the presence of the jingling bell. You see, it was so dark in the mornings, anyone could have raided the vegetable boxes without my knowing about it by stealthily sneaking up to my cart when my back was turned, and it would seem that the thief was a master at not being detected, but who on earth it was, I couldn't imagine at the time. So the very next day, as I was doing my milk rounds, I heard the jingle of the bell, and I immediately lit up the area with my torch, and I nearly dropped my torch in total horror, because I couldn't believe what I was actually seeing. "I take it, Grandpa, you saw Bigfoot," I giggled. "Boy, you must have been freaked out. I wish I'd been there to see your face." "You would be right about that, but at the time I had no idea what it was. All I could think to myself is, what the heck is that? I remember it didn't look like it liked the torchlight at all, and for a moment we just stood staring blankly at each other, hardly daring to believe what we were seeing. I really think the critter was more surprised to have been caught out by me. I think these critters really know how to slip into the shadows and remain undetected, so I think he was pretty surprised to get caught like that." "What did he look like, Grandpa?" "Well, at a guess I would say this thing was about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, possibly about 4 foot wide, maybe more or less, was covered in long brown red hair. I do remember thinking that this creature was very giant-like, and it was built like a truck. It was solid, sturdy, burly, and exceedingly strong and powerful. I could see that in an instant. It had very long arms, hectically big shoulders, and a cone-shaped head. It was human and yet not human, and it was ape and yet not ape, if you get my drift." "Wow! Was it aggressive, Grandpa?" "No, funnily enough, not at all. Just very surprised to have been observed, I think, by me. It was also a little bit impressed, I think, that I caught it out," chuckled my grandfather. "I don't know why, but I sensed that. It seemed to have a sense of humour, because I could swear it was having a chuckle to himself. I could be wrong, of course, but that's what I sensed." After the critter turned around, and the way he moved, it was with such a seamless grace. You should have seen it. He was so fast, and he was so agile and so athletic and lofty and majestic. Oh, my word, I was in total awe watching this thing moving back into the woods. I've never seen anything like it before. I was just absolutely gobsmacked. I would bring a box of fruit for the critter every single day, and I would just leave the box in the middle of the road, piled with bananas and fruit of every kind, and I would do this every day without fail. And this creature, he would dash into the middle of the road and grab the box, and then he was gone, and he always knew that I'd left it for him. Sometimes it would leave me strange presents from the earth, like feathers and stones and stuff like that, and then he would put them into the road and point to them, and then he was gone. It was wonderful. I just loved seeing him every single morning. He was the highlight of my day. One day it actually brought a sweet little Bigfoot to come and get the fruit with him. The little critter was about 3 foot tall, and it dived into the bananas at once with huge exuberant enthusiasm and gusto, eating them with the skin and still intact. I remember it watched me with these wide, curious, inquisitive eyes because it was so fascinated by me. And I got the sense that the big Bigfoot was literally introducing me to the little one, almost as if he was showing off his sprog to me like a very proud father. It was really very endearing, and I have to tell you that little Bigfoots are adorable because they have the most inquisitive, curious nature, and I rarely have to tell you they're naturally comical without even trying to be. One day the creature came and collected the box, and he left me a huge pair of antlers in the middle of the road for me. Very impressive they were. And then he pointed into the far distance, and I sensed that the Bigfoot was trying to tell me that he was moving on and saying goodbye. It turned out I was right in my assumption, because when I put the box in the middle of the road the following day, he never got it. And nor the day after that, or the day after that. That was when I began to realise that the creature had definitely moved on, and I was devastated. I was gutted and so depressed, because I had warmed so much to the Bigfoot, and after that experience, I have to tell you, the milk round was never quite the same again. I want to tell you something for nothing. I missed that big, hairy critter. It really was such a likeable character, with a huge, warm, engaging sense of humour, and not an ounce of malice in its entire body. I've no doubt in my mind that these creatures would help you in a heartbeat if you got caught up in a precarious situation. However, I'm quite sure there are others out there that may not be quite so nice. "Grandpa," I said, hugging him tightly, "that is the most beautiful story I've ever heard." I could see my grandfather was choking up with tears, so I was in no doubt that this Bigfoot had impacted his life in a very powerful, poignant way. As I live in the same location where my grandfather first encountered the Bigfoot, I keep hoping and praying that one of these Bigfoots or one of the offspring will cross my path one day, and if it happens, you and your listeners will be the very first to hear about it. So there you are. That's my story. Well, I have to say, Bernard, you're going to have to tell your grandfather that I am so thrilled to have, heard this incredible story. And thank you so very much for sharing it with us, because it really was quite a beautiful story. And I do love the way the Bigfoot actually stole the fruit from the back of the milk cart. And what a great idea, putting a cat bell on the bananas so that you caught the creature, who was clearly very impressed to be caught by humans, because they probably think they have the last laugh with us. They think they're too clever to get caught by us. So when they do, they find it very, very surprising. But another thing that just blew my mind was your story about, the poor young girl, Tammy Baker, giving birth behind a bush. And that you helped her and that your wife helped her, and you managed to keep this a secret from the parents of Tammy Baker, who would have taken it very, very badly if they had discovered that their 15-year-old daughter had given birth, which is terribly sad because they never got to know their grandson. But, that's what it was like in those days. And I actually heard a story from someone once who told me that they had a friend who was, this was in England, and this friend was in Ireland, and her parents were very, very strict in those days. I think it must have been in the early 80s or something, I was told that the story happened. And apparently this girl was so terrified of her parents because they were so strict. And, she was literally terrified. So she literally made an excuse and literally took the ferry over to England and got a legal abortion. Because she was she knew her life wouldn't be worth living if, they found out about the pregnancy. So I don't know if you know of any stories like that, because definitely if you do, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear them. But until next time, goodbye and good night.